Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hello. It's not good enough. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
A little better. I'd like to welcome you all to our last event in our James Baldwin 100-year birthday celebration. And I just want to really just express my gratitude for this entire year celebrating the life of James Baldwin as we have through the fire of this time, the lasting impact of James Baldwin's work, writing, and influence. I'd like to thank, of course, my team, Ms. Tony Burden, our administrative assistant, as well as Ms. Fabian Burrell, our coordinator for programming and community engagement. If you could please give them a round of applause. They do the hard work of getting everyone here, making sure everything is perfect for you all, and certainly providing some sustenance. So we have pizza, some pasta salad, some salad for you all to munch on as you watch the film. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the English Department, the Center for Academic Support and Enrichment, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. I would also like to give a special thank you to Provost Christopher Storm and our Dean, who's here with us, Vincent Wang, for their support. Round of applause for our Dean, please. And for our wonderful guest, Karen Thorsen, who is director of this phenomenal film. She will be in conversation with our very own Gregory Miller. Please, round of applause for Greg Miller. Right now, I'd like to invite the Dean to say a few words of welcome, and then, of course, I will say a couple more words, and then you'll hear from your professor, Professor Naylor, and then we will begin the film right
after. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's educational event. Even though it's film screening, I think that the larger purpose is educational. As Professor Lebinar has mentioned, that today this year we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the birth of James Baldwin, who is a very important figure, a writer, civil rights movement, whose ideas continue to affect the world we are in. And I just learned from talking to Director Karen Thorsen that there are many ways of commemorating the centennial. So our work is not done. I think that the important thing is that we continue grapple with the larger issues mentioned. Now, as you know, James Baldwin is a very important thinker for the race relations in the United States. And the film that we are about to see today, and Director Thorsen and Gregory Miller are going to talk about, is called The Price of the Ticket. In 1985, a book by this name, The Price of a Ticket, was published by James Baldwin by St. Martin's Press. This is an anthology collecting his nonfiction essays from spanning the years from 1948 to 1985. So it's a 37-year period, so a lot of essays. It offers Mr. Baldwin's reflections on race in America, and Karen, and then later, based on this, produced this film. Well, I have not watched this film, but I really look forward to it, and also, to learn from this. So that's all I want to say, and I want to once again congratulate and commend the Center for African, Black, and Caribbean Studies for taking on this centennial initiative to honor someone very important in our life, and also to remind us our work is not done yet. So best wishes for the event.
And now I'd like to invite your very own actor, director, filmmaker, and professor to give you a few announcements. Professor Naylor.
Yes, thank you guys. Thank you, and thank you guys for being on time. You know how much I appreciate that. It's really good to see everyone once again. It's been a while, and thank you for all the hard work that you've been doing over the last 7-8 weeks. It's definitely appreciated on my part. watching you grow, and now you have a great context for being able to receive this film. And so I ask that you stay open to those various constructions that we've been learning about and building along the way, and also to keep your observational perspective in mind in terms of what you see, in terms of what you're experiencing, but also what's happening with the narrative drive and your contextualization as reviewers, if you will, because this is the film that you're going to review this week. And so keep that in mind. I don't have a link so that you can rewatch it. This is the moment. So just stay in the moment, stay present, stay open, and you'll see many cross-references and intersections along the way that we've been building on from day one. So I look forward to reading your work, and I definitely appreciate that you're all here on time, and the journey continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Naylor. And finally, I'd like to introduce the director, Karen Thorsen. Please, warm welcome for her.
Thank you all. It's an honor. Jimmy is on my shoulder by the end of the screening. I hope he's on yours too. I had the privilege of first reading him when I was close to your age. I first met him 2 years before he died, and we were working on a film project together. And when he fell ill, he was in France, and the last time I spoke to him in September of way before you were born, 1987, he said, "Karen, I know why you're calling, and don't worry, we'll be filming by the end of the year." Well, we were not filming what he planned, but we did film what you're about to see. So I'll tell you more about that, but as your professor says, the journey continues. James Baldwin is not far from us, because he's really, really eloquent about what we need to understand right now.
All right, without further ado, we'll begin the film.
Maybe we can turn off the light. This is Douglas Dempsey, who is co-producer, co-writer of the film,
Yes, of
and also
course.
my partner.
Douglas Dempsey, thank
Welcome to Swarble Library and CABC sponsored event. I want to say a little bit about Ms. Thorsen. Ms. Karen Thorsen, read a little bit about her bio. She's an award-winning filmmaker, writer, finds inspiration in intersection of art and social justice. Her heroes are game changers, James Baldwin, game changers, the artists and artists who shape history. Her films tell stories without narration, as you see, weaving first-person narrative with archival treasures, which we witness here. Ms. Thorsen began as a writer. After graduating from Vassar College with a year at the Sorbonne, she was an editor at Simon & Schuster, journalist at Life magazine, and foreign correspondent for Time. Screenwriting followed, then directing. Her first feature film, Price of the Ticket, co-produces Bill Miles and Douglas Dempsey. That's who you see over there.
Bill sadly is no longer with us. He passed in 2013, or he'd be here too.
There you go. Widely considered a classic, it was first shown at America's Masters on PBS in 1989, which this is how long this film's been out. And it's the centerpiece of Thorsen's nonprofit initiative, the James Baldwin Project.org. You can go visit there.
That's, you need to go further.
Miss Karen Thorsen here.
I hope that I get to hear some of your reactions and questions, and there are so many stories that come with this journey that I was on with James Baldwin while he was alive and then while he was gone, but he is still with me. And somewhere around his 90th birthday, there was, Martin Scorsese, the filmmaker, who is also a preservationist. He was making a film for HBO on Fran Lebowitz, a young writer. She told Martin Scorsese that her hero was James Baldwin. And so she said, when I was 15 and I was growing up in New Jersey, and I was Jewish and I was gay and I was confused, and I started reading this amazing person and I fell in love with his mind. And so Martin Scorsese said, I would like to have a piece of your film on James Baldwin, which I know, and use it in my film for HBO. Well, my heart's going like this. And yes, we'll send over a video copy. He said, no, I know that you shot on 16 millimeter film, and let's get it out of the lab. Let's get the negative. Let's go back to the source. And when we brought the film print, the negative, out of the lab, we discovered amazingly, and this is where I will tell you, Jimmy started working through the universe somehow long after his passing. He's still at it. Because of that request for that film, we discovered that the tape around the film negative had not been properly fastened and the film was deteriorating. So he said, you've got to raise money and get this film restored, and otherwise it will be gone forever. So we did. That was Jimmy's 90th birthday, and it cost so much money to do that we said, well, maybe we should bring this film back out, and maybe James Baldwin deserves to be heard even more. Well, as over the last decade, he deserves to be heard.
Absolutely.
So,
Thank you. My first question.
Yes.
The opening scene, you start with the funeral, and then you end it with the funeral procession. Was that intentional in your narration? Your especially at St. John the Divine. I should tell you, his funeral was at St. John the Divine in Manhattan, which is really important. So we hear during that opening scene, we hear James Baldwin's mother crying, which is incredible for her loss and abandonment. And then towards the end, we see the African drummers taking Jimmy home, his homecoming, which is beautiful. And I know that you have a 45-minute film on the funeral itself. So here we are, you start the film with the opening funeral, and then you end it. Was that intentional?
It was certainly intentional, mainly because remember what you saw in the film is that Jimmy, as I will continue to call him, was out of favor when I first met him. He was not being taught. He was not getting good reviews. He wasn't even beloved by a lot of his own people. Black militants didn't think very highly of him. And he was gay, and this and that. So while we were working on a project that he wanted to do with my film company, and I will say that project I'll describe a little bit later, but the point about the funeral is well taken, because I'd ride around in a taxi while I was working with James Baldwin on this project that he wanted to do, and I'd ask taxi drivers, because in those days it was very affordable to ride in a taxi somewhere in Manhattan, and I'd ask people who came from all different countries, do you know who James Baldwin is? And most of them did not. And I thought, this is the audience Jimmy wanted to reach. And so when it came time for his death and the fact that he was going to have this extraordinarily huge, enormous, grandiose funeral at this cathedral that is still being built after it's been around for a century, and they're still building some of the parts of the steeples and pillars. And it was the first time also that they opened those gold doors in 5 years. They hadn't done it since Duke Ellington had his own memorial service in that cathedral. So yes, we decided to open with that. But what we found out when we were making the film, people said, oh, white robes, gold crosses? That doesn't sound like James Baldwin. These white filmmakers, they really... And the real logic behind it is this is the church where James Baldwin family actually attended. And this is the church where one of its nephews was head choir boy. And he wanted that to be their church. And moreover, we didn't lay in the drums. That was decided by the family. They wanted something that expressed James Baldwin's philosophy toward life. There were trombone players and Olatunji, the drummers, and there were also the white robes and gold crosses. He embraced all of that. And we wanted the world to understand he was really important. If they didn't know who he was, well, let's see what happens when you die.
There you go. My next question. I was privy to be invited to a rough cut of Melissa Hayslip's soul, exclamation point, on her uncle, Ellis Hayslip, who was the first African-American TV host on PBS in the 1970s, early 70s.
Oh.
So, yeah,
I'd
so
been there.
we're going there. But what happened was, during the rough cut, Ellis Hayslip was gay, queer, before it was in the 70s, before it was actually public. She didn't include it in the rough cut. So I saw her in the lobby, and I went up to her and I said, Melissa, you're not including his queerness. It's taking away from the film. And I really need you to include it. So I'm very happy that you included James Baldwin's narrative, his gay narrative, which is very important because that tells his life story, his autobiography, him, who he was, who he loved, who he cared about. That's so important to his soul and also to his sadness. So you pinpointing that in a time in 1989, which was not feasible because ACTA was happening, the AIDS crisis was happening. What made you go through that decision to include his queerness when it wasn't celebrated as it
Well,
is
first
now?
of all, I thank you for talking to Melissa that way because I had no idea that's the genesis of that.
Right.
But when we were making this film, there had been a film made on Langston Hughes not long before,
That's right.
art film, not long before Jimmy died. And this was someone who was a gay poet of great note and importance and influence in James Baldwin's life. And in fact, that entire film didn't mention that side of his life. I mean, really,
Very true.
it's important to say that James Baldwin was not in favor of labels. He said many, many times, and he says right at the top of our film, and we wanted to make that point early on, there is nothing more important than the human being. All the rest are subsets.
Right.
Now, he loved the phrase he wrote in multiple different essays, he repeated the phrase, an unexamined life is not worth living.
Yes.
Martin Luther King is also quoted saying that phrase. That phrase was originally said by Socrates right before he drank the hemlock poison. And Plato then wrote about it. So this is something that's been handed down through the centuries. People want you to examine your life. Me, you, all of us,
Right.
because we will discover things and be more honest with ourselves about, well, the labels some people impose upon us and the labels we impose upon ourselves, and our need for self-exploration, which if we do it well, will lead to growth and love of self, love of others, self-esteem. And so that was a facet, just a facet
Right.
of his life. And it was really hard to find footage about it. We included I've since found new details
Oh, wow.
that didn't,
Okay.
that I wish were in the film just because
Sure.
it would have expanded more on something. But James Baldwin, speaking of labels, never wanted to be labeled gay or queer. He wanted to make the point, as he does in an essay he wrote called Here Be Dragons, that, he didn't put it in these modern terms, but that we're all on a spectrum of male and female, and we have portions of that in each of us to varying degrees. And as he said, I've loved a few men and I've loved a few women. That's really all that saved my life.
And Gregory, I would just add one thing. Karen was right about finding all that her researchers and she could find that was even available, because, as she said, Jimmy himself didn't make it a topic. He would deal with it when asked. But what also worked in the film is you'll see as a subtext, it really speaks volumes, people who cannot get the words out. There's this ABC woman who's interviewing him about Giovanni's room, and she stumbles trying to get the word you wrote, and then even his editor Bill Cole, he's kind of stumbling, and Amiri Baraka almost folds in on himself trying to say Jimmy was not. So all of that speaks to a general feeling that followed Baldwin around and was sometimes used against him later on when he wasn't militant enough. At least that subtext is there.
Well, I'm glad you included the backlash from Eldridge Cleaver, which was substantial during that time because he had a foul boy. So whatever, you talked about someone being gay or gay affiliated, it was treated as really something awful.
Well, we may be entering some dark times right now, but I will remind you that Jimmy finished the book in 1955 and it was published in 1956, and it was first published in Great Britain. Only 2 years after they removed the fact that people would go to jail if they were caught with any
Yeah.
gay act.
Solicitation,
Uh,
yeah.
Queerness was criminal, and right now, a lot of things are becoming criminal.
Right. Thank you. Can you describe the process of gathering extensive archival footage and interviews featured in this film? What were some of the biggest challenges?
Oh man, it wouldn't have happened if, again, I go back to Jimmy and the universe. When he died, first of all, I didn't know what to do, because the kind of film that he and I were working with in the film company I was working with, Maisels Brothers, are known for cinema verite films. And cinema verite, if you're not familiar with that, you're film students though, so it may have come up. Cinema verite is basically when you follow a human of some interest, a storyteller perhaps, famous, that also helps, around with a camera crew and witness what goes on in whatever their life they're leading. Something's bound to happen, and somewhere in there will be a story. So James Baldwin was fascinated with film. He had, as a young person, even at age 10 in elementary school, an intern, a white intern who was a student at Columbia University, was working with the high schools in New York, and the principal of Jimmy's high schools pointed him out, knew there was something special there, but he was skinny, he was tiny, he was undernourished, he seemed sickly, but she said to the intern, take this boy under your wing, see what can happen. She took him to see movies, she took him to see plays, she took him to the theater. He saw Macbeth with a black cast, things that wouldn't have happened if, and he said, this young white woman not only taught me why I would never hate white people, but she also taught him to love movies. And so when I came along, he didn't hate me, he gave me permission to be a collaborator with him, and he said, yes, let's do a cinema verite project. All of that to say, cinema verite is where you follow someone around who is alive and doing something. So what do you do when your subject is suddenly gone? And this is where, we thought, okay, first of all, the day he died, I got a call from a colleague in our film office. A whole bunch of us worked in a group in a huge room together doing projects. And she said, Karen, did you hear? I just heard on NPR, James Baldwin died in France last night. And I had no idea, because he had told me when I spoke to him, don't worry, I'm sick, but I'm getting better. We'll be filming by the end of the year. So that day seemed like the end of the whole project. Long story short, I guess the project is dead. Got my mail for the day out of my little box, and in that mailbox, there's a letter from James Baldwin. And he writes, Dear Karen, I'm sorry to say, for reasons of health, I will not be able to participate in our film project as planned, period. And then big X, shaky handwriting, won't be able to participate in our film project as planned for the time being. So all that archival footage, we thought we're going to have photographs of him hunched over a typewriter, or we'll have some famous people read from his work. We had no idea that people had been inspired by his writings, by his speaking, by his essays, to follow him and just track him down with a camera.
Yeah, document.
And document the moment. And so that stuff started flying in the window. I mean, really, people wrote us from 15 different countries. People heard of the project and said, get in touch with so-and-so. Here's someone who did this. And gradually it all came together, and hundreds of hours from 15 different countries.
How did you put it in chronological order?
Because
Because it seems like it was telling his life.
Thank you.
It was telling his life story.
The chronology of his life is there, but what we thought when you make a film and you have a rough cut,
Yeah.
and as you were with Melissa,
Yeah.
that rough cut is an attempt to get it right, but you invite your peers and you try to get advice and input. And so what we really feared was that people would say, but how can you cut him at one age and then have him finish his sentence either 15 years earlier or 15 years later, and his hair is different and his clothing's different, and we feared the ping pong effect.
Right.
But in fact, we were told it didn't matter because, and this is the key, not because of our brilliant edit as much as Jimmy's consistency. How many people do you know who, when they're famous and then out of fame, beginning or accomplished, all the different stages of life, still keep the same philosophical center through line? He could finish his own sentences because he never stopped believing what he learned from the mother who was crying in church, which is, if we are going to save ourselves as human beings, we are going to need to love each other, and we're going to have to, sorry. Just thinking of his mother gets me.
Yeah, it got me in the film as well. Wow. His message was always clear. His message was always timely. His message was for us. His foresight was incredible. And you sit here, his words, his narration, his music
Yes, he's
is
his
still
voice singing.
with us. And it never ages. And that's what you have to believe. If you read James Baldwin consistently, or you know a little bit about James Baldwin, it's consistent. It's on time, even though it was written 30, 40 years ago. And that's what people don't realize. This is what's happening
Well,
with
that's
Baldwin.
the sad, it's the glorious part and it's the sad part. And a lot of people say, well, what would James Baldwin say if he were here now? And the tragedy is, Doug, where are you?
Yes.
Talk about the musician in New Orleans.
Well, we did one of these with the New Orleans. It's a national park, has a big jazz museum there, a big building, which is the National Jazz Museum. It's a national park, and at this event, a local jazz musician was speaking and helping, doing the question and answering with tourists who would come in and were doing this. And he talked about traveling around the world, and he said, "I'm tired of playing the blues because it's just entertainment for so many people, and it's getting so far away from what it's about." And he said also,
Oh, moreover, the trumpet player who said he didn't want the
but
film.
this is what I'm speaking of, Ashland, who said ultimately, "Karen, you made this film when?"
1989.
And you told him the date. It was actually when Jimmy died in '87, came out in '89. He said, "I want it to feel dated. I want this film to feel dated," but he was saying ruefully, to him it was as though Baldwin had said all these things yesterday.
Absolutely.
And that's what high school students tell us, and college students, the fact that this is speaking to now. But we can talk forever
Right.
because this was such a major gift in our lives. Obviously, we're still carrying it, but I'm fascinated to hear your input. I don't know where you want to take it from here.
Well, I have a couple more questions, and then can we invite you in? Is that possible? Okay. We're going to talk about Baldwin's legacy and his relevance. What do you believe is the most enduring aspect of James Baldwin's legacy, and how does the price of the ticket contribute to it?
Oh my. Oh. I
I
miss
mean,
him.
Right, well, yeah.
The fact that he gave so much to others, the fact that he was so incredibly curious that when I'm curious too, I wanted to ask him questions. He wanted to ask me questions. I felt him care about me in the most unexpected way. And I grew so much because of somehow our exchange gave me more growth than if I had just heard his answers to my questions. and he had these eyes. I mean, this is interesting. Talk about labels. He was one of the things that we always come back to talking about James Baldwin is his quest for identity, and it was really a lifelong struggle trying to figure out, as he put it, not what I am, but who I am. And so when he was little, the father, who was actually not his biological father, insulted him, told him he was ugly, called him frog eyes, put all kinds of really negative labels on him. James Baldwin first had to struggle out from under the rock that was being put on top of him, where he was not being allowed to believe in himself. And then later on, those same eyes, when Amiri Baraka is speaking in his funeral, the memorial for James Baldwin, he's talking about his great world-absorbing eyes, those same insulting eyes that Jimmy had been ashamed of.
Right,
so it
turning
came
on
full
its head,
circle.
right.
So I like that thought, because this is more than endearing, but it's important as a small detail, because it was a way for all of us to remember that the labels that people try to impose upon us are perhaps our strengths, but we just haven't seen it that way.
Absolutely.
So his big world-absorbing eyes, those were endearing.
Right, those are very endearing, and you see them at the painter Buford Delaney. You see his beautiful eyes.
Well, that's okay, I'll find them. I won't
You
go
see
far
his
without them.
beautiful eyes on display through Buford Delaney's portraitures of James Baldwin, and it's gorgeous, and the colors are amazing. So if you look up the painter Buford Delaney at some point, you'll see the testament that I'm talking about.
This was his father figure. When he couldn't deal
Absolutely.
with his stepfather, Buford Delaney, whom Jimmy met at age 17, when he says on screen that he had to leave home and leave the church the same day. Well, he left home, he went down to Greenwich Village, and someone had told him to go see Buford Delaney, who became his mentor and his friend, and actually in Buford's later end of life, Jimmy became his caregiver. But somewhere early on, one of the gifts, and I can tell by your nodding you know this, one of the gifts that Buford offered to young Jimmy was when they were crossing a street down in Greenwich Village, there was a puddle in the gutter. And Buford said, "So tell me what you see." Jimmy looked down and kind of scummy water, and I see water, I see dirt. And he said, Buford said, "Look again." And James Baldwin looked, and then multiple times, "Look again, look again." As he looked, he began to see the film of the oil on the surface of the water as a thing of beauty. And he began to see the details of the little things that were floating within it, that's, like the stars in the universe. And what that lesson was the painter telling James Baldwin, as a young would-be writer, remember to look more carefully and then describe what you see more carefully, because that will bring your storytelling to life.
That's true. Any questions from our students?
As a filmmaker, are you able to share with us when you found your purpose?
Say that again. As filmmakers.
As a filmmaker, are you able to share with us when you found your purpose?
Oh, purpose. Wow. Well, when I was 7, I was going to kill Khrushchev. But I'm old enough to know why that mattered. Back at the time, I thought naively that evil was embodied in one world leader, and I would probably be able to sneak in and do something about it. So there was purpose in that moment. But later on, it was more about, well, as you said at the beginning of your very flattering biographical description, which I wrote.
Right.
I do care very much about the intersection of art and social justice. And so I wanted to be a writer, which is part of what I first learned about James Baldwin. I should say this. The first time I discovered James Baldwin, apart from a few mentions around the family dining room table where my parents were concerned about social justice and gave me a good head start, I came back from my junior year abroad and took a course on African American literature. And one of the books assigned was Notes of a Native Son. And in his autobiographical notes and several of his essays, he's talking about his time in France. And he's talking about it not about being a black man in Paris as much as he's talking about his identity in relation to his country. And I had, decades later, gone to Paris to study, and it was during the Vietnam War and the aftermath, and I was very much questioning the decisions made by my country, and I was listening to French people talking about the Algerian War and Dien Bien Phu and all these things that happened in French history, and I was trying to understand how to be exactly what James Baldwin was trying to understand, how to be a proud American, a proud patriot, a proud someone who loved his or her country, and yet had plenty of things that I disagreed with. And so the purpose that I was finding when I first read James Baldwin was how to discover who I was, not what I was, but who I was and what that meant and how that would lead me going forward. He wrote about it in such eloquent ways. I thought, oh man, this guy, we didn't connect because I was white and he was black or vice versa. It was because he had something important to say about identity, and that was my particular crisis in my young years, and he helped me go somewhere with that.
I'm going to give a short answer that you skipped around the filmmaking question,
Oh.
which is she was a journalist first at Life magazine and Time and so forth, and learned how to interview people and put together their story in their words, because they would say volumes, but people would end up telling her things that the family didn't even know, and it would all be. So when she came to documentary, she realized a lot of people start in documentary, they come from photography. And so it's very much of capturing the moment. And if you are a psychology major like Albert Maysles, you also have this ability to be in a room with someone and make them comfortable, and they start telling their story. All of those things, I feel, when you got to Maysles and saw how that fit in, you found your purpose in that kind of filmmaking. And then it went sideways when the cinema verite film with Baldwin didn't happen, but from circumstance, this other film presented itself through David and the family and so forth.
And I will say also on a more superficial level that as a writer, you get to use your skills as a writer in filmmaking, but you get to play with additional toys. And that's really a very seductive, and it's a team effort.
Sure.
So you saw the credits.
Anyone else? Yes.
So we delved into like the philosophy and message of James Baldwin, right? But I wanted to know like what was like the philosophy or like the message that resonated with you to be like, I want to immortalize this philosophy, because when you make a film, you immortalize his legacy, and that's how he lives on, his message. So what was like that message or idea that resonated with you?
That's a great question. I don't know if I could have articulated it at the time, but as I have spent time watching my own film and also watching Jimmy and reading Jimmy and exploring that question, I would right now sum it up as an extraordinary duality that I would have thought was a contradiction in terms. The fact that he was able to be absolutely rightfully and righteously angry and yet never lose hope. That ability allows me to move forward and to somehow understand my anger at things that I don't personally agree with, but also to find that I do believe in human potential. I do believe that, well, there's a quote, it's a line in Letter to My Nephew, which is the first essay in The Fire Next Time. And he says, most of mankind is not all of mankind. So there is a portion of people who are trying to move things forward. And when he says why did we choose it to be the final statement, David, his brother, obviously gives the emotional summation of, yes, there is something to be found in the rubble and the ruins, but Jimmy's last statement is, we all can become better than we are. He's not lecturing us. He's not even unleashing the full eloquence of his anger, which he was plenty good at. He is giving us hope and a mission, how to take it forward. So I'd say the greatest desire, I would talk about the film that we were going to make together, because it speaks to this. He had a book contract, to write a book that he wanted to call Remember This House. And sometimes he described it as re/member, putting the pieces back together. And it was going to be about his friends Martin, Malcolm, Edgar, and it wasn't going to be through them because they were gone. It was going to be about his pain over their loss, and it was difficult to write. He had writer's block, and so he decided that making a cinema verite film while he was trying to research and write this book would help him write it. And so his focus was on the kids of these three friends of his. They were close enough friends so that he was around when their babies were born, and he watched them grow up, and every time he came back through the States, they would meet up. So the goal of our Cinema Verite project would be to follow Jimmy as he spent time with these three late teens, 20-somethings, the daughter of Malcolm X, the son of Martin Luther King, and the son of Medgar Evers. And he wanted to see the world through their eyes. Remember, he was a teacher at a university. He was up at UMass. He was a 5-college professor. And he was thrilled, as Cynthia Packard, the professor who reads that last letter from him, said. He loved that part of his life. Yes, he was out of favor in one world, but he found
Community.
He found justification for everything in the young people, and that means you. So talk about taking it forward. He's laying it on you.
Yes. Yes.
This was like a really heavy film, and I could just feel the love kind of through how people spoke about him. I wanted to know how was it interviewing those that he was around and influenced? Did it kind of I felt just seeing it was emotional, but how was it actually being there?
Each one has its own story. We could spend hours talking about why we chose each person. I think is a good place to begin, because Cinema Verite, it's not usual to have on-camera interviews because you're usually just having the footage of the moment and watching the moment unfold. But we knew that if we picked friends and colleagues of Jimmy and a couple of people who were really critical of him, and we knew we already had a rough cut of the archival footage, so we knew what Jimmy had to say. So I figured out what questions to ask so that they would be responding to Jimmy, and then I could remove myself from the conversation. So a lot of it was an exercise in humility. I was not on camera at all. And the other was the exercise in creating a conversation. And so to be the fly on the wall witnessing the conversation as if Jimmy is still with his people whom he loved, or say in Mary Baraka or Ishmael Reed's case, they had criticized him vocally during his creative lifetime. We thought they'd come on camera and say a few things that were going to balance the praise. We asked them after the camera had stopped rolling, why didn't you say what you used to say about James Baldwin? They said, well, that's what artists do to keep each other honest while we're still creating. But once someone's gone, you care more about the legacy. So I'm not giving you a full answer. Each of those people had so much to share, but our goal was to create a conversation with Jimmy and his friends, even though they were no longer in the same plane.
But tell her about the first moment you walked into the room with Dr. Angela.
Oh, well, there. Oh, dear. Well,
Dr. Maya.
First of all, imagine how many here have read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings? Have you? It's a wonderful book. I mean, it's a heavy too, but it made me feel, and I read it not shortly before going to interview her because I wanted to be informed. And I knew how close a friend she was of James Baldwin. So I walk in, having just read this book, feeling totally on a first-person level with her, and go, oh, Maya. And she says, my dear, you will call me Dr. Angelo. And I thought I'd blown it, that the interview wasn't going to work. This was the most important person we could interview, and there went that opportunity. And it wasn't that at all. She just said, I've worked long and hard for this title, and I would like the respect that goes with it. And now, what would you like me to talk about?
There you go.
And she was lovely. And
gear.
moreover,
And
there's
switch gear.
there's
Right.
a sequel to that. When we finally got to editing a film a conversation between Jimmy and all his friends and all of this archival footage and the richness of it, we had completely forgotten about one detail. Our executive producer, rather like Greg coming in to remind us at a rough cut, our executive producer came in and said, yeah, but Karen, what about the writing? We had not included any readings or excerpts at all of his work. We were just assuming that you'd go read the books.
Right.
And so suddenly I had to call up Dr. Angelo and say, could we possibly film you again? And would you be willing to read from some, and of course her voice is so extraordinary, how could you not want her to do the reading? But she said, well, I'm awfully busy, and my heart sinks again. She said, but there is one weekend where I might be available, President's Weekend. They never asked me to talk, February. All those dead white men. I'm free that weekend usually, and I'm having some friends over for dinner, but come on, fly down with your crew. And we walk in, and she's stirring this big pot of gumbo. She's perspiring. She's just in an apron, and I didn't know how it would go, but I had a whole suitcase of Jimmy's books when I folded down some pages, and I said, maybe, you can look at some of these excerpts when you have a moment and choose ones that you see fit to read. And at one point she stops stirring the gumbo and says, well, okay, and she takes the book and she goes off into some back room, and she said, set up your shot, I'll be back. And then she comes out in this extraordinary turban, absolutely glowing and ready to do her brother Jimmy justice. And she said, oh, by the way, I've picked my excerpts, and you'll bear with me because I will edit some of them. And she said, Jimmy would understand, it's okay, I'm just going to take out the swears.
Okay.
And indeed, if you compare her readings to the actual books, there are words that have been eliminated, and never do you witness it. She's smooth as smooth. But that's how we finally got to remember to include such an important part, and it was thanks to one of the people who were obviously there for Jimmy.
Some?
So I wanted to ask about your screening of Mr. Baldwin's life in France, Turkey, and also where else, Algeria as well. So I know superficially you were making references to those places because Mr. Baldwin was in those places, and I also noticed that specifically in France you were making references to Les Miserables, and so these references actually remind me of not just racial inequality but also just wealth gap in general, and also racial inequality in overseas as well, so in different parts of the world. But would you say, in a deeper level, were you trying to highlight those concerns as well? And I'm also wondering if there are other intentions that you had when you were filming those portions as well.
That's a wonderful question, and absolutely the truth is yes, but it was really, those were James Baldwin's words when he talked about Les Miserables. He always rose past the labels of black, white, or racial inequality to human injustice, and he cared about class struggles, economic struggles, just like Martin Luther King. That was not just about the March on Washington was to be followed. He was concerned with poverty. He was concerned with religious discrimination. He was concerned with all forms of social injustice. And so it's really simply our attempt to hold up a reflection of what, just a distillation really, of what James Baldwin wanted us to think about. And when we went and filmed on the 3 continents, and we did do that, and it was an extraordinary journey to do that in the company of James Baldwin's closest allies, friends and brothers. We then, as filmmakers, wanted to have what was cinema verite footage of the places where James Baldwin lived. So we turned something sepia, and some of the archival footage of location is ours, but shot in modern day, or at least after Jimmy's passing. But we changed the footage to fit with his archival comments and make them more period, so it was more seamless. So yes, it was intentional to go fake the timing a little bit and go deeper with the message. And the end result is that we had 2 years of film festivals where we were invited to show the film all over the world. And in almost every country, whether it was Germany or Australia, they would eventually come to the discussions. We'd try to turn the discussion back to their own lives. And indeed, James Baldwin was speaking to them in Germany. They talked about the Gästwelcome, the immigrants whom are, even today in the headlines and having trouble dealing with what is going on in Germany. The same thing was true in Australia with Aboriginal people. And everywhere, what James Baldwin brought was the urge to talk about their lives, people's lives, with him as the prism, but really talking about the situation they were living, their lived experience.
I would also say that, you had to cover a lot of ground with the whole biography. That little section where he does bring class and economics into it, and then his rant on the Dick Cavett show, he was always very aware of racism in part being an excuse, a capitalist excuse for class warfare and so on. And he was addressing that with all his mantras of the... but if you're familiar with Raoul Peck's film, I Am Not Your Negro, you learn a little about Raoul Peck. He's a staunch Marxist, and he saw Jimmy as a kind of natural Marxist, and a lot of Jimmy being an activist in that film, it's pulled from The Devil Finds Work, because Jimmy's observing American identity through films and so forth. And he's all over that kind of, it's the whole society and the capitalism and so forth. He would leap right to that, understand how they were feeding each other.
Yeah, someone had a question over here.
Sorry. I had a question in regards to like perception. I know that perception played like a really big role in this film. All of the different perspectives basically combined to make this film. I wanted to know, like, how did you choose? Like, how did you decide which perspectives made it or which didn't?
Interestingly, Raoul Peck, who's a filmmaker whom I have had conversations with, his perspective was advancing an agenda that he very much believes in and I support, and his film is very much a voice for the 21st century. But when we made the film, still in the 20th century, what I wanted to do was the perspective of showing people why this person who had been forgotten mattered, because at the time he was being forgotten first, and then the essence that mattered to me, and again it's part of finding purpose. I wanted to express what Jimmy told me came to him from his mother, that human beings matter, and love is not just about our intimate exchanges, although that is a form of love, but it's about a quest for growth, and it's a quest for understanding each other and learning how we can each contribute to our collective being. So it was really that overwhelmed me, that sensation of love. And it was a word that he wasn't ashamed to use, even though it's sometimes dismissed.
Follow-up question. Now that you mentioned love, how do you kind of, I know there's like a fine line between love and hate, so how do you kind of, I don't know, differentiate?
Just like anger and hope. They are contradictions that coexist because of the nature of our humanity. Humanity is imperfect, and it's still on this arc bending, we hope, toward justice, but boy, there are bumps in the road. So love and hate, one thing, James Baldwin's pretty articulate, love is the only way we're going to save ourselves, and hatred never fails to destroy, what's the quote? Hatred will destroy the hater is a paraphrase. But about hope, the quote that I often find myself turning to is that if you can change, even by a millimeter, the way some a person sees reality, then you can change reality. Now, I grant you that's one step at a time, way too slow. But on the other hand, that we go back to the most of mankind is not all of mankind. There are always people whose need to have their vision of reality changed.
And she's asking in part about the burden. The burden is the hard part.
We do
When
this
you want to
social
hate, but
identity
you have to
workshop
love.
where we've got 14 quotes of James Baldwin from over 5 decades of his lifetime, all talking about identity in one way or another. So this one, our humanity is our burden, our life. We need not battle for it. We need only to do what is infinitely more difficult, that is, accept it. And hatred is in there, love is in there, so is anger, and I would say that bitterness is not in there if you're moving toward some kind of better place.
And on that note, we like to thank filmmaker, director, Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And I would like